I thought I would do a video about Amicus Anthology Horror films. Now, Amicus Studios was a film company that was the contemporary of Hammer Horror. Now, Hammer did more sort of gothic period pieces, and Amicus did more sort of contemporary pieces at the time in the sort of 60s and 70s. And they were most famous for their anthology horror although they did do a few feature-length films, most notably probably they did like The Land That Time Forgot, I think, and they did like the Doctor Who films in the 60s. But anyway, the anthology horror films are what they're most famous for. Now, I'm a massive anthology horror film fan. Anthology horror is basically a film that has a bunch of standalone stories, like short films, and there's a wraparound story that somehow connects them or contains them. An example would be Creepshow, where a boy's reading a comic book, and we see the stories that he's reading play out. And the wraparound is about this there's a little story about the boy and his relationship with his father, who's trying to get him to stop reading these comic books. Now, that's the wraparound story. So anyway, Amicus, what are some of my favourite ones? I'll probably do videos on some of these films individually and go into them in a little bit more depth, but Dr. Terror's House of Horror was, I think that was the first Amicus Anthology Horror film. I might be wrong, but I think it was in the early 60s, and it's probably my favourite. It's the first one that I've seen, and it's about a group of men that sort of coincidentally meet up and they're staying in a cabin on a steam train travelling through England, and then you've got like Donald Sutherland, Christopher Lee, Roy Castle, and what happens is Peter Cushing comes in and he starts playing with these tarot cards, and then he ends up reading each of the men's fortunes in there, and there's a nice little wraparound story about what happens to all of them. And while the individual stories aren't maybe quite as good as some of the other anthology horror films, it's still my favourite because it's got a fantastic atmosphere, and just that dynamic between that group of actors is phenomenal when they're just in that cabin together. It's really great. So I definitely suggest that one. There are other ones that are famous. There's Torture Garden, which is maybe a little bit, I'd say it's probably a little less known, but it's very good. Burgess Meredith, who owns this sort of museum, bit like Madame Tussauds, sort of waxworks thing, or it's more like, you know, torture devices and things like that. Each of them has a story basically that plays out. That one was very good. You've also got Tales from the Crypt, and you've got Vault of Horror, both of which were EC comics that actually inspired the anthology horror genre. And Creepshow, in fact, is an homage to those comic books of the 1950s. They're pretty good. Tales from the Crypt and Vault of Horror, they're pretty good. There's a good story in which one is it? I think it's Vault of Horror, where Tom Baker is a painter, and he discovers this ability to paint pictures, and then anybody that he doesn't like, if he does something to the picture, that thing will happen to the people he doesn't like. That's quite a good story. And there's also what other ones are From Beyond the Grave, which is one of my favourite ones, which is about, sorry, I've still got a bit of a cold. Peter Cushing, who is an antiques dealer, and he's got this little grubby shop underneath this bridge, and it's about the people that come to the shop who then steal from him basically, and they steal an antique, or they rip him off somehow. They don't pay enough, or they steal money from his till when he's not looking, so that they've not paid as much for whatever they're asking for. And the item always ends up cursed and something bad happens to them. And my favourite story was one about this antique door that this man buys, and he takes it to his house, and it basically just, he puts it on in a doorway that just leads into a cupboard, but at certain times when he opens the door now, there's this ancient room sitting through it, and it's still dark and sort of tinted blue, and there's cobwebs everywhere, and he starts sort of going in and peering in and looking into it and investigating it, and eventually realises there's actually someone in the room. And I always thought that was very creepy. And there's also a remake of a story from Dead of Night, which is an anthology horror film I've talked about, the sort of granddaddy of anthology horror films. So almost a remake of the Haunted Mirror sort of story from Dead of Night. That's really good. Some great actors in there, people like Donald Pleasance are in that film. It's fantastic. And you've also got The House that Dripped Blood, which is just basically a story about a detective investigating a house where all of these gruesome events have happened, and it's the stories of the different people that have lived there. And there's a good one about Christopher Lee, and he's got a daughter who seems to have supernatural powers, and he's trying to isolate her from the world, and he hires a nanny to help look after her, and the nanny sort of gets torn between whether the father has been abusive or whether he's actually doing the right thing. That's a good one. The last, oh no, in fact there's the Asylum as well, which some people hold up as the best. Asylum's probably got the best wraparound story. It stars Robert Powell, and it's about how he goes to this asylum to go for a job interview, and in the job interview to be a psychiatrist there, and he is basically told by the guy that runs the asylum, if you can go into this secure ward and go into each cell, interview a few people, if you can tell me which one of them is your predecessor, because apparently he or she went mad, then you get the job. And it's got the best wraparound, and there's some good stories in there. You get Herbert Lom in there as well, which is great. And finally, there's a film called Monster Club, which a lot of people think is an Amicus film, but it's not an Amicus film, but it very much feels like one. And it was made in Britain as well, I think, and it is about Vincent Price sort of runs this nightclub for monsters. It's quite ridiculous, and he invites this human being in, and then they tell him stories about the different monsters. And it's quite cheesy, it's quite tacky, but it's got some charm to it. However, even though it's probably one of the lesser anthology films in terms of quality, it's one of the best stories. In fact, arguably maybe the best story in anthology horror history, where a film director is scouting locations in England, and he goes to this little town, and the town's surrounded by fog. He goes through the fog, he ends up getting stuck there. It's almost as if the town's like has never left the 1800s. Everybody's dressed in rags, and they end up chasing him. People that are in the town end up chasing him to this church, and he's stuck in this church. And when he's in this abandoned church, he finds a diary that's been written by this priest, and it's about how this priest took pity on this ghoul and took him into the church, and then basically infested the whole town. It's really good. It's really creepy. So yeah, Amicus Horror, brilliant anthology films. There are a lot of other great anthology horror films over there. I've got a collection of them, about 60 films. It's almost complete, I think. Fantastic genre, and definitely watch them. Great fun, really great fun. And that's all. Thanks for listening.